Thank you so much, sir. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you the next speaker of this plenary session, Dr. Stefan Fiol, Professor of Ethnomusicology and affiliated faculty in Anthropology and Asian Studies at the University of Cincinnati College, Conservatory of Music. He's the grandson of Professor Bruno Nettel, a distinguished ethnomusicologist. Since joining CCM in 2010, his research has focused on music, dance, ritual, and media in Uttarakhand, Himalayas, and North India. His book, Recasting Folk in the Himalayas, received the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies Jim Fisher Book Award, and his current projects explore drumming as a historiographic tool and the role of music and mindfulness in cognitive function, developed through collaborations with therapists and neurologists. Professor Fiol's work has appeared in leading journals and edited volumes, supported by fellowships from Fulbright Nehru, Wenner-Gren, AIIS, NEH, and the University of Cincinnati. He earned his PhD in musicology from the University of Illinois in 2008 after extensive fieldwork in India with additional projects in Chile, Paraguay, and Zimbabwe. Trained in classical piano, he also performs on sitar, Ambira Zawajimu, hope I'm pronouncing it right, and Himalayan instruments. Welcome, Professor Stephen Fiol. The session is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to all of you at the University of Hyderabad for hosting this beautiful conference. I'm so excited to engage. I have pre-recorded, partly because I didn't know how my brain would be functioning here at around 1:30 a.m. But I will just ask that you play the recording, and I hope to engage with the questions afterwards. Thank you. Greetings. My name is Stefan Fiol, and I just want to thank the conference organizers and also just to say that I'm honored to be on this panel with Professor Dan Newman and Professor Dard Newman, and I look forward to the discussion. I want to start just by playing a brief video clip of the Dhol-Damau from the Garhwal Himalayas. Who owns the Dhol and Damau? And how can this tradition be ethically sustained and stewarded in the 21st century? These are fraught questions that intersect with contemporary caste and gender politics, with competing oral and literary epistemologies, and with changing roles for Dhol and Damau across rural and urban contexts. Despite these drums having been transmitted and maintained for centuries within hereditary Dalit families, locally referred to as Auji, Bajgi, or Dholi, referring to the social role, there has been a dramatic rise in interest among Savarns in learning this art form. And I'm thinking specifically of Brahmin and Thakur or Rajput communities in Uttarakhand, but generally just perceived caste-dominant individuals. This interest is a direct result of the growth of the folk music industry, evidenced by the naming of Dhol and Damau as official regional instruments of Uttarakhand some years ago. And it's also linked to the more recent refusal of many Dholis to perform their hereditary obligations for patrons. So today I want to explore a couple of mixed caste institutions where Dhol Damau is now being taught, but I'll begin with an origin story about Dhol Damau that foregrounds issues of caste ownership. Parvati wanted to dance, and so Shivji created the dhol and presented it to Brahmaji. There were 4 Vedas, but Dhol Sagar is the 5th, Shyam Veda. Brahmaji refused, so Shiva requested Vishnu, but he also refused. Parvati was disappointed, so Shivji brought it back to Brahmaji, who created the kondoti, shoulder strap, and put it around Shivji's shoulders. Shivji then played the 5 types of Brahm Shabd, or Dhyal, from which 5 human forms of Shiva emerged, and he sent them to Bhulok. Thus Shiva gave knowledge to the Auji community, who played in his lineage or vansh. They alone have this spiritual power, which is not in others. This story was recounted to me by numerous drummers during my fieldwork in the Garhwal Himalayas, and this origin story is part of the Dhol Sagar, an esoteric and elusive treatise composed in a mixture of Gorkhali, Pahari, and Sanskrit languages that contains tantric and cosmological stories of the Dhol-Damau. While some transcribed excerpts from the Dhol Sagar survived, such as this one, and some have then been published in the 20th century, it primarily exists as an oral tradition within the Dholi community. And these narratives emphasize the exalted position of the drummer, but variants of these stories can also convey an element of original sin, whereby Vishwakarma or another divine progenitor knowingly or unknowingly commit an act of pollution, such as killing a deer for its skin or putting the mouth to the skin in the act of making the drum, thereby forever marking descendants with a lower status. Such narratives relate to scriptural descriptions of the relationship between 2 of the forefathers of Hindu society, Lord Vishwakarma, the divine architect of the universe, whom many lowered status artisan communities regard as a spiritual ancestor, and his uncle Brahmaji. According to many scriptural accounts, Vishwakarma wears the sacred thread, suggesting a status equal to Brahma. Yet one Dholi related the following story that accounts for Vishwakarma's fall in status. Vishwakarma and Bhagwan were both tempted to eat a cow, Kapila Gai. Then the cow was butchered and divided up, and both ate their fill, and it was time to wash hands. But Bhagwan said he wouldn't wash hands after Vishwakarma, as the latter had killed a cow and eaten it. He responded, "Bhagwanji, you have done the same." But the latter revealed all the meat which he had merely piled up in his sleeve, thus tricking the unsuspecting Vishwakarma. From that point on, the latter, and presumably his descendants, was doomed to untouchability. So depending on where, when, how these narratives are told, and maybe most centrally who tells them, they can either reinforce the rigidity of the caste hierarchy, naturalizing the subservient position of the drummer, or they can satirize the system and elevate the position of the dholi. Shekhar, a singer-songwriter from the Rajput community of Pauri Garhwal, insisted to me that Brahmins were once the most knowledgeable drummers in all of Uttarakhand. If the tradition had remained in their hands, he claimed, then all rhythmic patterns, or bhajas, would have been transcribed in their original form. As proof of this, he noted that all existing books on the Dhol Sagar from the 20th century had been written and published by Brahmins. Unfortunately, dhol playing passed on to the Das community. He lamented, and as long as the dhol stays on their weak shoulders, it will remain weak. The Dhol Sagar clearly shows that there was but one way to play each of these bhajas, he told me. And pulling Shiv Prasad Dabral's 1989 publication entitled Dhol Sagar Sangraha, off the shelf, and pointing to specific transcribed examples. Contemporary drummers may insist they're correct, but that's only because of illiteracy and the corruption of the tradition over time. Shekhar then related a story that his father used to tell about a Brahmin drummer who beat out a Das or a Auji drummer during a Shabad performance at a wedding. The latter conceded defeat and asked the Brahmin from which Das had he learned to play, implying, "Who was your father?" The Brahmin apparently stopped playing the Dhol-Damau from then onwards because of a perceived insult that his father could have been an Auji. So, from our conversation, several themes emerged that I think are relevant to questions of caste ownership. First, Shekhar assumed that inscribed knowledge was more authoritative and reliable than orally maintained knowledge, to the extent that an inscribed version of a bhaja written by a Brahmin scholar in 1989 was more valuable, more authoritative than the hereditary knowledge of the unnamed drummer from whom this Pandit undoubtedly copied out the transcription. One of my Dholi collaborators put it thus: Brahmins have done the work of a typist, working with Aujis who were illiterate, but they don't own this knowledge. And this same interlocutor told me a story about a Brahmin elder from Jakol who thought he could play as well as an Auji, and he was struck down dead. Second, I think in these conversations there was an assumption, possibly coming from the tabla tradition of which Shekhar was a student, that the cycle length is the primary determinant of what a bhaja is, of its ontology. And this is a point that's been critiqued by Professor Andrew Alter, among others. And related to this point, Shekhar assumed that all performances of bhajas derive from a single authorized structure, an ur form that has degenerated over time. This is refuted by evidence from my own ongoing large-scale study of bhajas from various parts of the region. And without going into a lot of details, what I'm finding is that there are very distinct dialects of this Dhol-Damau drumming that take shape in relation to geographic features of the landscape, the pilgrimage routes, and kinship settlement patterns, so that you can actually identify very distinct dialects across the region. Shekhar, of course, also reiterated an idea that has been perpetuated by a number of Savarn intellectuals in Uttarakhand in recent years, that Brahmins were once the authoritative drummers and bards of the region. I find this a particularly violent co-optation of the source of identity and power within hereditary drumming communities. And it's not an accident that the anecdote Shekhar uses to explain why this one Brahmin stopped playing Dhol-Damau was rooted in the logic of caste discrimination, linking the social role of drumming to a specific Auji social identity. Shekhar's narrative justifies Savarn reclamation of the dhol playing tradition by insisting that Aujis, and not centuries of Savarn caste oppression, were responsible for decay in the dhol playing tradition. The idea that Brahmins were the former custodians of Dhol-Damau and are thus the saviors of its future can be a way to refute the realities of caste oppression by escaping any shared accountability for the oppressive patronage conditions under which Dalit bodies have and continue to labor for centuries. Some Savarns have used these narratives to subvert the demands of Dalits by claiming reverse discrimination and assuming an aggrieved position for themselves, bolstered by ideologies of divine sanction, settler colonialism, and strategic erasures and distortions of history that maintain superiority at all costs. One Brahmin professor told me that reservations and the climate of caste wokeness were prohibiting members of his community from playing dhol, thereby restricting their opportunities for livelihood and upholding the barriers of caste that they seek to tear down. I think such arguments pose a barrier to social accountability and healing. Shekhar's discourse is also rooted in a neoliberal ideology of individual choice. At some unspecified moment in history, he claims Dalit chose to take on the responsibilities of musical performance, or, in Shekhar's narrative, Savarns chose to leave it to Dalits. More recently, many Dalits are choosing to abandon these responsibilities, and in response, Savarns are merely choosing to assume responsibility of playing themselves. Yet this emphasis on choice ignores a patronage system rooted in mutual but inequitable obligations between perceived dominant and lowered castes. Male members of hereditary drumming families generally do not have a choice about where, when, or whether to perform. It's a mandatory obligation to their patrons, and those who abandon this responsibility can face violent consequences. Finally, Shekhar's narrative presents a causal link between lower caste abandonment and upper caste adoption. Yet these two processes are happening in different social contexts that are largely independent of one another. While in village settings, the performance of ritual singing and drumming remains exclusively the duty of hereditary artisans, upper caste youth are seeking out opportunities to learn and perform this music in the semi-urban and urban settings, where there are more lucrative commercial opportunities. So rural and urban settings are rooted in quite different economic and prestige systems. With my remaining time, I want to explore how these discursive tensions around communal ownership and stewardship play out within several multi-caste contexts where Dhol and Damau knowledge is being transmitted. At one of the government universities in the region, there is a certificate program in folk arts and culture that allows students to receive credit for studying Dhol and Damau. And the program explicitly emulates the Guru Shishya Paramparik model from Hindustani musical contexts. Students are asked to learn from a village-based drummer for an extended period of training, after which they return to campus for an examination and perform in front of a faculty committee. But because this institute hasn't hired any hereditary drummers on staff, the evaluation is completed by individuals who do not intimately know the repertoire. I had the opportunity to interview one of the drummers, the hereditary drummers, who trained a university student under this certificate program. The student wanted to learn a very central item of the repertoire, an asymmetrical baja called bade. And after 10 days, he was becoming frustrated that he couldn't play it. So this dholi drummer told me that these things take time. The student wasn't really dedicating himself to the task. But then some weeks later, the guru was summoned to campus to sign the certificate at the end of the program, indicating that the student was trained. So despite limited exposure and minimal competence, this student would presumably be able to use this certificate and potentially get employment to teach folk music. Another context that I'm ethnographically exploring is a folk music institute founded and directed by a well-known hereditary drummer in the capital city of Dehradun, where hereditary Auji and Savarn students learn to perform on Dhol and Damau. I interviewed 6 Savarn students and 6 students from the Auji hereditary community. All of them came to this institute 3 days a week, and despite the fact that there were no fees or tuitions, only one of the 6 Savarn students had informed their family that they were enrolled in this institute. They were embarrassed to be publicly associated with dhol playing. One Savarn student remarked that his parents were supporting him while he was looking for work, and if they learned he was using any of his time on learning drumming, they would likely turn him out of the house. At a public concert held 5 months after the initial period of studying, only 2 of the 6 Savarn students in the group attended, again pointing to the ongoing stigma.
हमें एजुकेट होना पड़ेगा. अगर कोई ऐसा कहता है कि नहीं है गलत हो, अगर हमें कहता है कि चलो आप करके दिखाओ, तो हम उसको करके दिखा सकें. हमारे परिवार में, हमारे गांव में ऐसा बंदा होना चाहिए जो उसको करके दिखा सके, जो वेल ट्रेंड हो. उनके जो इस तरह का परिवार है, जैसे कि कालिदास के परिवार से है, जो बजाने आ रखा, जो बजा रहे हैं, तो उनके मन में रहेगा कि यहाँ पे मेरे को बिल्कुल अच्छा बजाना है, गलत बजाना तो बिल्कुल बर्दाश्त नहीं है, अच्छा बजाना है, नहीं तो वो खुद बजा लेंगे.
This student's narrative reveals a casual comfort with caste supremacy. His motivation to learn Dhol-Damau was not to become a proficient performer, but to know the bajas well enough to surveil the performances of Auji drummers in his village. He sought to assert his authority as a quality control expert and a patron who could enforce oversight and correction. I'd like to end by thinking about a few different models for the sustainability of the Dhol-Damau performance tradition, and by extension, possibly other hereditary musical practices across South Asia. One model follows the logic of free market development and cultural nationalism, or Dhol as regional heritage. There's no question that the growth of the folk music industry has created new opportunities for artists, both hereditary and non-hereditary, to teach, perform, and lay claim to this knowledge in a range of contexts. Those who can monetize the tradition are doing so, and Dhol-Damau are conceptualized as emblems of regional heritage. Yet the risks here are that the growth of these commercial opportunities surrounding traditional drumming are skewed towards the urban areas where non-hereditary performers lacking expertise are most likely to benefit. Another risk is that the tradition becomes significantly diluted and starts to emphasize more standardized and virtuosic aspects of the repertoire. Another model follows the logic of the ritual economy and patronage systems that have existed for centuries, right? So here, knowledge transmission of Dhol and Damau is restricted to these caste-based hereditary lineages. But the risk is that ongoing caste-based stigma, discrimination, bonded labor will lead more hereditary artists to abandon drumming as a form of livelihood. To varying extents, both of those models are being implemented and continuing, but a third model points towards a more ethical kind of stewardship, a middle path, perhaps, in which Savarn non-hereditary artists come into relationship with hereditary drummers. Rather than claims of ownership or surveillance, ethical stewardship asks how privileged bodies might center caste-based histories and truths with cultural humility and accountability. Others can learn Dhol and Damau with the understanding that that belongs to Auji hereditary communities. Borrowing an idea from Jeff Todd Titan, Dhol-Damau performance may be understood to enact a cultural commons by bringing Garhwali communities into relationship with Devi Devtao, with the land, and with each other. Some of my examples from this talk in inter-caste learning context reveal the perils of this particular path. Reconditioning from caste supremacy is very challenging work, but it must be reckoned with in order to bring about corrective community formation in which everyone thrives. I will end here, and thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to Q&A. I see, Andrew, did you have a question?
I do have a question. Is it all right if I ask one? Thanks, Stefan. All right, many of you will find Stefan has answered all my questions from my paper 2 days from now, so you don't need to watch it. A very simple question. Here you've tackled the problem that I've always had to tackle and not done very well with. To when people ask you, how do we save this tradition? How do we protect it? And you've provided a theoretical overview that does do that from a theoretical stance. How do you adjust your answer to those questions that I'm sure you've been asked many times when you're talking to people directly, when they ask you, how can we save this tradition of Dhol-Damau?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's obviously a very complex question, because of the variety of positionalities of people asking that question, right? So and also the social context more generally of where that question is being asked. So part of what I was trying to explore is how different we have to approach that in a rural setting with these very embedded caste structures, as opposed to a more urban setting. And then also, of course, what is the work of the person asking that question? It's different with different bodies. Even myself, I mean, I would often, and you probably had this experience studying these traditions from a kind of white body. It's a very different onus, and sometimes that would be thrust on me as if, you know, Professor Fiol, you're learning this, and our own children don't want to learn this. I would get that reaction a lot. Oh, like as if I am somehow in it to in playing it and learning it to sort of show what others can't do or something, right? So that's a very, again, it's about each person's position and what we have to assume and work on. So I think it's a very poor answer to your question, but I think people are looking for a quick and easy way to say, you can save it by doing this. And I think what I'm saying is this whole tradition is really underwritten by a lot of challenging histories, and we can't run away from it. We have to collectively look at it, take accountability for it, and that's the way towards healing. And ultimately, everyone has a stake in it and can play it. I don't think the right answer is to say this is exclusive, but in order for other communities to enter into it, there has to be some honesty, I think. So that would probably be my, whether I have the guts to tell that to every single person, I don't know. But that would be my answer.
Sir, if I may bring in Professor Ravi Sharma wants to ask you a question. Professor Ravi Sharma, sir. Okay, I'll ask on his behalf. He says, why the family members of Dhol community are not learning Dhol these days?
So it's primarily the young people, but not entirely. I've met quite a few in the older generation who've also stopped playing. And it's primarily because of stigma, because of a sense that they will be treated as less than by association with the instrument. And certainly more in the younger generation are turning away from it for that reason. That's a very, very common story. There's also I think the ritual economy doesn't provide a livelihood. Now there are more opportunities in urban places. Weddings in the urban centers are more lucrative, but in the rural areas, people have been turning away from this. And that has produced a really interesting consequence where those who are continuing to do it are in more demand. And sometimes if you are playing for patrons outside of your own village, you can demand a better fees, and you can thus, make it a livelihood. Because the people in most of the villages have stopped playing, or many of the villages have stopped playing, those who continue to play can actually now turn out a little bit more of a livelihood. But the status issue remains.
Thank you very much, sir.
As we have Professor Daniel Newman as discussant, I might sound a little emotional, but indeed this is a very emotional moment for us. Just as the sun needs no introduction, such is the eminence of Professor Daniel M. Newman. And what makes this moment even more special is, despite being in an online space, his presence transcends all distance and reaches us with the same warmth and inspiration. Sir, it's truly a moment of deep honor and heartfelt joy for us to have you here today. Even across screens and time zones, your presence feels close, guiding, and deeply meaningful to all of us who gathered here. We genuinely feel blessed to have you joined us, sir. Your work has illuminated paths for generations of scholars and musicians, and today, through this virtual platform, the light continues to inspire each one of us. As I said, he needs no introduction, yet it is my privilege to briefly reflect upon his extraordinary journey. A distinguished ethnomusicologist, he is widely recognized for his leadership and scholarship, notably serving as Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost at the University of California, Los Angeles, Interim Director, UCLA, Herb Alpert School of Music, Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director, New Center for Arts and Culture, Boston. His research focuses on the social organization of Hindustani classical music and the ethnography of Indian music culture. He also pioneered digital humanities projects, including Atlas of World Music and the World Music Navigator. I know we all are very eager to listen to this legend. So I take this privilege to invite most respected Professor Daniel M. Newman to kindly share his remarks. And it's actually a very extraordinary moment to witness the wisdom of two generations of the same gharana as Professor Dad told us. And this was a brilliant idea of Professor Sanjay Bandyopadhyay to bring all three of them together. So I welcome Professor Newman again. Sir, we are here to listen to you.
Well, thank you for those very kind words. I really appreciate them. I also appreciate Sanjay's invitation as well. And it's a great honor for me to be here. In the interest of full disclosure, you know already that Dart is my son, but Stefan Fiol is the grandson of my own guru in ethnomusicology, the late Professor Bruno Nettle. So it is one big family, in case that wasn't clear in the earlier introductions. Having confessed, allow me to celebrate the excellence of both these outstanding papers, each the result of many years of research, with a few words about what makes their contributions notable and how they intersect with one another. I will be reiterating some things because I think sometimes it's good to underline through a different interpretation what has been said. In Stefan's paper, the focus ultimately is on stewardship. He asks, as we just heard, who owns the Dhol and Damau? And how can this tradition be ethically taught and stewarded in the 21st century? His paper's contribution is based on what I would call his thick description, revolving around several key elements. The first is the use of a sustained interview with a single articulate savarn, that is a Rajput interlocutor, Shekhar, as one side of the ideological anchor for the whole analysis. Rather than surveying the sovereign reclamation discourse in aggregate, the paper stays close to one voice, traces that voice's logic carefully, and lets a structural pattern emerge through the particular. The paper uses Shekhar's recommendation of Dabral's 1989 Dhol Sagar Sangra as a specific case where reformist textualization becomes actionable in the Garhwali case. The second is found in his analysis of two distinct institutes, one located in the Srinagar University that provides certificates for students studying the Dhol-Damau drums, but there's no faculty expert in this knowledge, so students learn from village-based drummers. In the one particularly interesting case cited, the village drummer was obliged to sign the certificate even though the student wasn't yet trained. The other side of this is the Folk Music Institute in Dehradun, founded by a hereditary drummer. There, the class was divided 50% between the dominant caste students and 50% the hereditary drumming students. But only one of the dominant caste students told their family about studying there because of this extreme stigma still prevalent associated with drumming there. Their motivations for studying the drums were varied, but at least one dominant caste student was learning in order to ensure the hereditary performances were done correctly. Over here, we would call that chutzpah. Over there, I would just say that presumption underscores the challenges of the traditional hierarchy. Another element is the Ukhal comparative table based on Fiol's earlier research. 12 drummers, 3 districts, 4 structurally distinct renderings of the same named Baja. This is a dialectological evidence, and it does precise analytical work. It refutes the Ur form thesis empirically. Within the scope of this paper alone, the table is a genuinely original piece of musical analytical argument. It treats regional variation as evidence against single origin narratives rather than as evidence of corruption. Finally, there's a 3-model typology, what might be called applied ethnomusicology: free market development, restriction to hereditary lineages, and inter-caste learning contexts. Each of the first 2 paired with its distinctive failure mode. The paper advocates for ethical stewardship. It is in fact a middle path in which dominant caste articles develop relations with hereditary drummers with, as Stefan puts it, cultural humility and accountability. He recognized how difficult this would be to achieve, but he says this must be reckoned with in order to bring about corrective community formation in which everyone thrives. Stefan's calibrated restraint is distinctive. Taken together, the paper's originality is a matter of combining a carefully chosen ethnographic focus, 1 interview, and institutional ethnography, the 2 places where drumming is taught, a systematic comparative corpus, the 12 drummers, and a candid typology of institutional options, 3 models with paired risks into a single argument about stewardship. The central tension here is between, on the one hand, the hereditary, non-hereditary competition between communities, and on the other, the formation of institutions in order to promote one or another vision for the ontological claims to origins, and this, I would argue, claim to primal authenticities. This is a phenomenon, as you all must know, which we find again and again in Indian case studies. And I could give a long lecture on that topic. How are we on time? How the 2 papers connect. The 2 papers meet most productively, not at the level of institutional analysis, they're doing different things there, but at the level of hereditary epistemology. Read Dard's paper back into Stefan's. Is there an oral scholastic tradition among the Auji drummers analogous to what Dard documents for his Khandani musicians? The Dhol Sagar origin narratives and the Dholi's critique of Brahmin typists suggests that there is. Stefan's Dialects of Dhol project that he's working on already takes the hereditary drummer's knowledge seriously at the level Dard accords to Hindustani ustads. The Ukhal table documents a structured body of dialectical variation that the drummers hold in memory and can reproduce on request, and Stefan reads this variation as a historiographic evidence. Conversely, Fiol's ethnography gives sharper political texture to Dard's historical claim. The Zakaruddin Khan scene at the AIMC, the musician's relocation of research from the calibrated harmonium to voice, hand, and ear, takes place in a room the musicians did not design in front of interlocutors who did not share his epistemic commitments. Fiol's Shekhar interview shows parallel dynamic unfolding a century later, a Savarn interlocutor asserting an inscriptional authority, the 1989 Dobral transcription, against which the hereditary drummer's practice is measured and found corrupted. The continuity across a century is striking. Dard documents the hereditary response at the moment of the encounter with reformist inscription, and Stefan documents it a century later, now defending against a localized version of the same move. Let me just conclude that there's a way of looking all of this in terms of a hereditary intellectual authority that shows itself at each stage in the longue durée of the 20th century. And then the ustads of the oral archive who articulated Andalang, Ang, and Chal, to the drummers today who refute the Ur form thesis in the idiom of typist critique. Read together, Dard's analysis and Fiol's ethnography document an ongoing tradition of hereditary theorizing that moves through different forms and different registers. This framing makes the two papers complementary rather than structurally parallel and keeps each on its own ground. Dard's is a historical archival argument and a methodological platform for engaging that archive. Stefan Fiol's is an ethnographic political argument and an analysis of a contest over stewardship. They meet in their shared refusal to treat hereditary musicians as anything less than theorizing subjects. Thank you.